So it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Claas, to the Coronavirus Multi-Species Reading Group. You've offered some great readings for us this week, and I know that you told us just to read the conclusion to your book, but I actually dove in and read more, and I was really struck in the introduction about how you engaged with modes of antimicrobial transfer. I mean, we're thinking a lot about virality now and ways that genes jump around. So I was particularly struck by this account of all the different ways that genes, move kind of in clusters across species, and how these constellations of antibiotic infrastructures that you describe as they proliferate worldwide are also generating the conditions of possibility for these emergent new kinds of life. But actually you also go to show that maybe it's not new after all, and some of these early microbial samples had some of these same genes in there. So I was particularly interested in that as we're thinking about the sounds of coughing pigs. I'm also curious about ways that, I mean, you talk a lot about how antibiotics in some cases can be a costly or less costly intervention, but I would think that knowledge is also costly in these places. And I'm curious about kind of the praxeography or enactment of testing, or different technologies that are mobilized to determine kind of who's wiggling in a given constellation of infrastructures and organisms. But kind of with that brief introduction, and also gesturing to the two other pieces that are accounting for these uses of antibiotics broadly in industrial agriculture, I'd just like to invite you to have the floor. And as always, and especially today, since I have a potential Zoom bomber in the back, feel free to just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question, or type something in the chat if anyone wants to jump in.
That's great. I mean, should I first start by kind of like, giving a bit more about the rationale of the book, etc. Yeah.
That'd be great.
First off, again, thanks really for having me. I've been silently following you on YouTube for a while, so it's really great to be a speaker here today. So what I did ahead of the meeting today was, I think, a bit shamelessly sending free links to 3 different articles around. One of them was the conclusion for the book, and the 3 articles kind of show the different sides of antimicrobial use and antimicrobial resistance that I'm trying to tackle with the work, which kind of ranges from really basic historical research to more policy-facing attempts to make social sciences, don't want to say useful, but to bring a social sciences perspective into current debates about antimicrobial stewardship, etc., which are heavily loaded with imagery that the policymakers using often aren't really aware of. So I think perhaps to start off with, it might be useful to kind of just do a very brief recap about how antimicrobials are used in agriculture, and to really just highlight that they have acquired infrastructural importance, to use the work by Claire Chandler as a kind of matrix to think about it. So essentially what we have done since the 1930s is use antimicrobials for various purposes in agriculture. Mostly it's to treat animals, but also increasingly to prevent sickness from occurring in the first place in animals. And for a brief time, I mean, it's 50, 60 years, there was a very strong belief that if you gave antimicrobials regularly to animals at very small doses, you could also promote their growth. And this is now heavily contested by allegedly optimizing the intestinal flora. And this wasn't just done for animals. For a brief while during the 1950s, the US also experimented with feeding children in Guatemala small doses of antimicrobials quite regularly to allegedly overcome malnutrition. So this was, again, one of these Cold War technologies of plenty that were being employed both in humans and in non-humans at the same time. There are 3 different kind of big risks associated with antimicrobial use. The first one is in the case of agriculture, animal welfare. So, if you have drugs that keep an animal alive enough, long enough to produce a profit, there is a danger in some cases that welfare is neglected. The other one is, obviously, if you feed high doses or give high doses of antimicrobials, you can end up having residues in food produce, which can, if the doses are high enough of certain antibiotics, can trigger allergic reactions in humans. And then last lastly, but not least, one of the most prominent health hazards, I think, of our day nowadays, which is antimicrobial resistance. And as I'm sure the group knows, it's one of the big global health challenges facing humanity, I think, in the next 100 years, with a crumbling antibiotic infrastructure that we continue to rely on in all manner of ways in both health systems and food production. And what the 3 articles today that I sent really do is try to conceptualize that from different angles. So with farming animals, the one I sent around, that was really an attempt to really map very broad at a kind of global level how antimicrobials were distributed, and to really break with this narrative of antimicrobial use in agriculture as just a product of American big ag, or, you know, capitalism with a big C. And what you actually see when you look on both sides of the Iron Curtain are remarkably similar patterns of use, remarkably similar infrastructures that are created to produce animals. And I think, you know, a real historical challenge to not be lazy and just see this as a kind of capitalist conspiracy, but to see antibiotics as a kind of fallout of trying to increase animal metabolisms to a degree where they satisfy a kind of 20th century promise of progress as consumption of meat in many cases, or consumption of animal protein. And antibiotics in this system really serve as increasingly important lubricants that keep these mass production systems rolling, both in the West and in the East, and then from the 1970s onwards also in the quote unquote global South, increasingly, either as a result of, you know, national policies that are supposed to push production, as in the case of Brazil, fast exports, as in the case of, you know, supply chains, Western supply chains that force local producers to become like the West by buying into antibiotic-heavy supply chains, or finally, simply as a result of small and medium-scale farms also adopting antibiotics for their many benefits in making animal production easier. So that was what Farming Animals was really about. It's really writing this history as a global history and breaking the myth of antibiotics as some kind of northern technology or some kind of, you know, just capitalist narrative, even though these narratives are also important in this story. Pyrrhic Progress itself is very much a book that, you know, as Eben has already said, you know, it's a very complex book in the sense that it tries to bring together lots of different perspectives, but essentially it was born out of my observation coming from the Rachel Carson Center in Munich originally, that my German perceptions of what I should be scared about in terms of antibiotics were radically challenged when I went abroad and suddenly found that consumers weren't afraid of the same things I was afraid of. And you could even see this with supermarket labels when I went to a US supermarket or to a British supermarket, where the labels advertising welfare in Britain were not the same as the labels in Germany with bio and, you know, promising purity, whereas in the US antibiotic free means very different things. So the book is an attempt to reflect on how one technology trying to produce, you know, one form of consumption came to be viewed so differently in different countries, and how that then translates into regulatory failure at the international level when it comes to, you know, trying to contain a very collective global risk. And then finally, you know, the book reflects on this, you know, with stories for regulators, etc. And then finally, it's trying to use this knowledge of history as a kind of long-term survey of quite an old technology now, to turn it into something useful for policymakers. And that's what Setting the Standard is. That's the most recent article that I published with lots of great colleagues from the social sciences, where we tried to overcome what one critic of us once called arm waving, you know, where we were all saying that they had to think structurally, that they had to, you know, find more complex and locally attuned situations, but really actually thinking deeply about how we could translate critical social sciences theory and critical social sciences approaches into something that made sense for people who were actually confronted with devising concrete regulatory texts to deal with a very complex microbial phenomenon and a very complex global phenomenon. And we identified in this text 4 different problems surrounding metrics. How you measure antimicrobial resistance is obviously then how you come to define the problem, how you prioritize what kind of interventions to go for, because antibiotics have huge benefits, right? Not using them means forgoing all of their benefits. So how do you prioritize what benefits to go for, and how do you prioritize what kind of risks you want to have? How do you implement that, especially in settings where you don't have a highly financed infrastructure in health and food production systems? Essentially, how can you devise global regulations for things that have to be regulated completely differently at the ground? And then finally, obviously, the big elephant in any room, with regards to global health, the huge issues surrounding inequality, where most areas of very resource poor settings actually have a much bigger problem of antibiotic access rather than any form of antibiotic overuse. And we came up with a kind of, I mean, you have to have a flashy acronym nowadays. So we came up with a set of standards. A call for more structural, equitable, and tracked antibiotic policies. And then we define in the text what we actually mean with that. So yeah, I will stop talking now. So that's kind of the different facets of my engagement with antimicrobials.
I'm just curious if you've seen any transformation of these antibiotic infrastructures in the post-pandemic landscape. In the North American context, we saw how meatpacking and other associated industries became newly recognized as essential work and sort of muscled through at all costs. Have you seen these forms of intense animal confined modes of production of meat being transformed in either the European context or elsewhere?
So Alex Blanchard has written fascinating anthropological studies about how biosecurity for animals in large-scale American production facilities translates into enhanced biosecurity for the entire landscapes and the workers involved in the production of these animals. And I think what we've seen during the pandemic is a kind of exacerbation of that tendency. I think it's been a fairly universal experience in Europe and North America that meatpacking plants in particular rely on very low-paid labor, they're living in very bad living conditions, and that there were mass outbreaks of COVID there. So what you essentially saw was the meat packers trying to export the standards that they had to produce biosecure animals in these situations to their meat packers with mass testing, restrictions on movement, so that was in many ways a kind of extension of a logic of trying to control microbial environments that had been pioneered quite successfully with animals to the human workforce processing these animals in many cases. I don't think as such it has done anything at the moment to heighten awareness of antimicrobial stewardship. In fact, last year, if you've been following reports at the kind of WHO level, etc., what you saw was, this community that's been quite successful in forming around antimicrobial resistance really struggling to make itself heard over COVID-19. And that's why we had the Scientific American article come out quite early during the pandemic to kind of raise awareness for the fact that after COVID, at some point, will not have passed, but will have become normalized, I think. We will still be facing a huge crisis, both in terms of innovation and stewardship.
And maybe back to my opening comments, could we talk of sort of an antimicrobial virome? So you outline the mechanisms of horizontal gene transfer, transfection with phage, transformation with the little circle things that the bacteria are passing amongst themselves, and then conjugation with bacterial sex. And then you're talking about how these clusters of genes move across species lines. So do you think, is there, in a sense then, a antimicrobial virome that's emerged within these infrastructures of antibiotics?
Absolutely, and it even has a name. I mean, it's called the resistome. So Hannah Landick has been really, one of the big thinkers in this area, showing how cultural desires manifest themselves now within the cultures we take from the earth into the form of the genes that we isolate from the bacteria. I mean, there's always a danger when you deal with antimicrobial resistance that you kind of reify a story where antimicrobial resistance starts with human use of antimicrobials. That's obviously not true. Antimicrobial warfare between bacteria or to just manage bacterial relations has been ongoing for millennia. So lots of the resistance factors we are now getting out of the resistome are millennia old. They predate the antimicrobial revolution in human medicine and animal production. But nonetheless, obviously, mass selection at this planetary scale that we've been seeing really since the 1950s, I think, that has changed dynamics of the microbiome around us. And one of the first people to really phrase it this way was a British scientist called Ephraim Stewart. He then anglicized his name to Andy Anderson, working in the 1960s, who, by working with bacteriophage, which are viruses that only infect bacteria, really came to appreciate that what he was seeing was not just an epidemiology of resistant strains in the kind of classic microbiological sense, but he was seeing an epidemiology of genes. And translating that knowledge that you were not just dealing with resistance as microbes, but resistance as genetic information that was proliferating and being promiscuous at a global level, that took quite a long time to make it into regulatory circles that were still following very traditional cause and effect protocols. And so it's really no coincidence, for example, that the European Union, which in the 1980s marketed itself as a kind of precautionary force for consumer protection as a way to gain political legitimacy, is more successful initially in integrating AMR than the old US structures, which go with cause and effect and proof in courts with regards to mass antibiotic use in agriculture. So that really is a complete game changer in the way that substances are regulated. These findings in the 60s, and there's a very famous American microbiologist called Stuart Levi, who recently died, who speaks of the planet being covered in a thin soup of tetracyclines by the 1950s, 1960s. And obviously, again, we live in the soup and we continue to add to the soup with new antibiotic classes.
And I'll keep asking. I've got tons of questions, but others, again, feel free to jump in. With that sort of global spread of this resistome, has anyone done the tracking work to think about kind of modes of promiscuity, to think about to think with the phrase that you just used? How are these getting around?
Yeah, so I mean that tracking work is very interesting. And when I was reading the initial reports about alleged Indian variants, British variants, etc., I was thinking very much about, during the early 2000s, the naming of NDM1 as the New Delhi metallo-beta-lactamase. I think that's probably incorrect pronounced, but the kind of labeling within the antibiotic genre. We've currently got a paper that's under review at the moment with Alex Broom and Nicolas Fortanet and lots of other social scientists, where we really look back at AMR as a way also of understanding how during the COVID-19 crisis there is a displacement of blame onto specific geographic locations for allegedly unrational use of drugs. And this correlates very much in the late 1990s, early 2000s with a growing northern interest in southern environments. So this return of One Health/tropical medicine as looking for risky disease landscapes in the global south as a potential security threat to the global north, but also as a very useful means of mobilizing resources for international organizations like the WHO as a means to kind of justify shifting towards governance of these environments via international mandates. So that's forthcoming at the moment. So but yeah, so there's a long history of mapping alleged origins, and then also using these maps to justify regulatory, well, I won't say infringements, but regulatory pressure on other territories to adapt usage.
Warren, go ahead.
Right, I think my question would follow from that, actually. I'm actually interested in the issue of a sort of ethical symmetry in attribution of blame for antimicrobial resistance. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, because it seems to me that certain animals are stigmatized in a sense, or the way maybe their handlers or managers are stigmatized, but the animals themselves seem to cop a lot of blame for this, but also certain groups in the world. And we tend to be blind to the role of our own societies in developing antimicrobial resistance. Or am I wrong? What do you think?
I think you're absolutely right, this is what a large part of Pyrrhic Progress is about. It's to map risk discourses and blame discourses both at the transnational level, but also within the community. And in the case of agriculture, obviously the community that always gets the most blame are the farmers. As an allegedly illiterate group of users who overuse, who are greedy, who waste the resources for the others, but actually end up in the book being shown to also be the victims of a new form of food production that is desired by society and of supply chain mechanisms that profit other sectors in society, but still regularly displace the blame on them. I mean, Scott Podolsky has also written about this in the context of discourses about alleged rational drug use, which emerged in the 1950s as a way for physicians to protect themselves against accusations of overprescription, and also as a way to try to regulate American industry from selling inefficacious drug combinations, but at the same time refrain from regulating that same industry by saying we just have to use drugs rationally. At the global level, there's a whole another level to this, where there's been a very long story, and you still see this going on nowadays with conflicts about mass drug administration of azithromycin, for example, for prophylactic purposes, where resistance emergence in the global south is blamed on alleged overuse by populations in the global south without taking into account the wider structural factors that lead to this overuse and actually make this overuse rational in these specific contexts. So there are various nuances in this, but in the case of antimicrobials, because stewardship, so reducing usage, preserving a global resource, is so much at the heart of antimicrobial discourse, we often end up coming up with labels of blame. Sorry, that's my son being carried up the stairs on the other side of the door. So we often end up with these labels of blame, but we very rarely ask who will profit from the specific form of stewardship and why we are stewarding specific forms of drugs over others. And that's very much also the case in the agricultural story, where, as I already said at the beginning, antibiotics also have advantages and benefits for lots of different actor groups. So it's always weighing at the global level in a kind of power dynamic, whose benefits outweigh whose risks. And often enough, the weakest, most amorphous actor groups tend to be the ones that bear disproportionate blame, even though that isn't actually the case.
So in the realm of human guts, when we see the proliferation of these antimicrobial resistant strains of microbes, one thing that Jamie Lorimer and others have described in the probiotic turn is the prevalence of sort of a post-Pasteurian biopolitics, sort of a reinfection with the good microbes, either through fecal transplants or other means. And I'm wondering, in these industrial agricultural assemblages, what happens when you get a outbreak of some of these clusters of genes that might be hopping around organisms that are producing antimicrobial, antibiotic resistance to multiple classes of antibodies? What's actually done at these facilities?
So very simply, in animal facilities, often enough you go for cults, which it's an attempt to reset production dynamics in those settings. It's also quite interesting. I mean, even though we now use a language of genes and promiscuous genes and resistance factors, etc., what is still the determining factor for most biosecurity interventions are individual organisms. So it's actually we're not really dealing with genes flowing, and it's nearly impossible to do that too. I mean, it's not just as though the genes hop between pathogens, they're also in the commensal flora around us, which is why it's so very difficult to find effective ways of dealing with antimicrobial resistance. I think what's happened in the long term since the 1990s, when new political pressure really started rising on industry, is an attempt to optimize microbial environments with the help of more sophisticated monitoring techniques. And again, this is where Alex Blanchard's works is also really good, where despite, I think, 1990s hopes that stronger regulation would produce an agriculture that is more akin to organic agriculture, these visions of a kind of better, rural past of small scale production, etc., what we've actually seen is that concerns about stewardship, concerns about preserving the antimicrobial commons have actually accelerated in some parts the rise of intensified agriculture, because only that at that scale are these investments with the profit margins that currently exist in animal husbandry, possible, where you can create these kind of predictable biosecurity facilities that will predictably produce meats that meets these norms in a sustainable, business-like sustainable fashion. I mean, organic is a very interesting story again to also think about in this context, because in many ways the success of the organic industry as branding itself as a kind of thing consumers should go for is very much also, it emerges in tandem to the thing it opposes, right? So the organic label, the organic promises are very much framed as a kind of ex negativo vision of industrialized agriculture. And that's also what the book traces by going through the publications of Jerome Rodale, in the case of the US, or the Soil Association in the case of the UK, where from a very broad range of visions, actually what you see in the case of antibiotics is that after initially actually welcoming the advent of antibiotics as something that is natural from the earth, right, into food production, they then rephrase it as something to counter this factory-like demon that is eating up alleged British values, or the natural associations with the soil. So we have both with the stewardship discourse the rise of better financed biosecurity protocols by large integrated manufacturers, and at the same time a very successful upmarket value label that brands itself in opposition to this, but actually ironically also exists because of the industrialized agriculture it's opposing.
May I pitch in? I have a question. Like when I read your paper on farming animals, I read it as a very pessimistic history of antibiotic use, and you just mentioned your concept of the antibiotic commons. I was wondering whether you could say something more about that concept of the antibiotic commons. And in the other paper, you mentioned some of the strategies perhaps for going forward. But I also noticed you didn't mention any obstacles. Like, could you perhaps explain some of the strategies of going forward with the antibiotic, let's call it crisis, or the AMR crisis, and perhaps some of the obstacles you see and how to perhaps going forward with it, yeah.
I think I think that's an excellent question. And I think the longer you work on antibiotics, sometimes the more pessimist you become, because essentially these warnings have been raised nearly with the identical rhetoric and the identical scientific scenarios since 1965. And international action has been very slow. I mean, it has emerged, it's becoming stronger, but we still haven't reached a point where we are in a position to have interventions that are sufficiently targeted and detailed to really deal with it at a global level. So let's say, obstacles and chances going forward. So we're focusing on setting the standard, which is really the attempt to move from pessimism and only criticizing to something where social sciences can contribute in a constructive way going forward. We identify 3 different interventions. So structural, equitable, and tracked. And the structural one and the equitable one are probably the most important ones. And that is to shift from antibiotic-specific interventions to antibiotic-sensitive interventions. So what a big problem in the history of antimicrobials has been is what Claire Chandler calls a history of technical quick fixes, where you have interventions that focus on eliminating a specific kind of organism or eliminating a specific kind of antimicrobial usage without really asking why that antimicrobial has been used in the first place, and fixing the conditions that are driving this use and the dependencies that we see in large parts of healthcare and food production on antimicrobials in the first place. And in Pyrrhic Progress, that was already the first attempt to kind of articulate something for like this. It's to think about in terms of microbial resilience. So rather than think about antimicrobials by themselves, you have to think about the antimicrobial as a technology of regulating a wider microbial environment. And so any intervention going forward has to be an intervention that is tailored to managing wider environments rather than just protecting an antimicrobial resource. Because too often, and this is how international law works, if you define a problem as protecting an antimicrobial, you end up with having regulations that just focus on this antimicrobial, but leave out of focus this wider environment, which also has co-selection factors on it. In it has the promiscuous genes in it. And you also miss out the fact that the most vulnerable people in a supply chain often end up being the people who bear the disproportionate blame for it. So you end up with regulations that target farmers and ban farmer access to antibiotics, even though actually it's in many cases the veterinarians making the profits of selling these drugs, or larger supply chains that have an interest in both selling drugs and feeds at the same time. So that is I think one of the central things that is both an obstacle going forward, but also a positive way of going forward, is by rephrasing the way that we define these problems and by thinking more structurally at a broader level. The equitable notion is also extremely important, because we have to break with a very long tradition of framing antimicrobial resistance as a way to protect novel healthcare infrastructures. And we have to think much deeper about what antimicrobials mean to people in different settings. You could, for example, again, take the case of azithromycin resistance, where in the case of typhoid at the moment, we're facing a large outbreak of extensively drug-resistant typhoid in Pakistan's Sindh province, and this outbreak is spreading. And it's, until 1 year ago, was still sensitive to azithromycin. It's a cheap, affordable oral antibiotic. Resistance to azithromycin is now also emerging. Now, what initially happened at the global level was to protect azithromycin and to stop this misuse of azithromycin by local people on the ground. Now, unfortunately, in a setting where you don't have lots of healthcare access, going for azithromycin in these settings is eminently rational. It is the only oral antibiotic that you can afford. It is the only treatment that is possible. So going for stewardship in this context is not productive at all. You need an alternative way of framing an intervention. And again, the paper proposes numerous ways of doing this. Another thing that we call for in the case of tracked interventions is to move away from simply monitoring usage and equating it to resistance, to going for multifaceted tracked indicators. So correlating, for example, forms of antimicrobial resistance measure with measurements of overall infectious disease prevalence in an environment, which will give you different forms of intervention that logically arise from this, where you're not just measuring overuse as correlating to resistance and therefore, going down the route of rational drug use, blaming specific groups, etc., but you start highlighting the contextual forms of pressure that actually make specific forms of usage rational in a specific context. So it really is an attempt to move from this pessimism, from, I think, what social scientists do very well, a kind of critique and highlighting complexity, to using the complexity to formulate strategies that take it into account going forward, without just arm waving and blaming regulators for being context blind. So sorry, it's a long answer, but the paper makes this much more, concise.
On the issue of reframing antimicrobial resistance, could you say a bit more about the use of the term resistance? You touched on it, I think, just then. It strikes me as a sort of, it predetermines a lot of things if you use the concept of resistance. I mean, why don't we talk about microbial immunity or microbial tolerance, or evolved and adapted microbes, rather than antimicrobial resistance? And so it's this interesting, I suppose it's a military metaphor, a war metaphor. And how does that shape the way we deal with the problem?
That's a great question. So originally, antimicrobial resistance was not called AMR, or it was called drug fastness, meaning that a microbe was fast or resistant against the use of the drug that was being used to target it. And that use dominated large parts of the literature until, I would say, the 30s, 40s, when there's this rephrasing of antimicrobial, into the resistance that we have nowadays. I think the use of the term resistance, and here again, we can also draw on some of the work by Nicholas King and scalar politics. It's really to mobilize action, So by rephrasing it as resistance to a certain drug, you can find ways of overcoming this resistance. You can galvanize action. You can present antimicrobial resistance not just as an ecological phenomenon, which is natural, but as something that can be fixed and is amenable to regulatory and technological innovation and intervention. And so I think that's you're very, on point with regards to that. I don't know how possible it would even be nowadays to think of redesigning the language around it, because it is now so established. There is a dedicated AMR community of which I'm a part, right? I profit from the AMR funding streams that go out. I mean, it's been a long-standing concern within the community with the Wellcome Trust, for example, funding large-scale service about how you could phrase it differently, because it doesn't really mean a lot to people outside of the AMR community. I mean, what is antimicrobial resistance? Surveys usually reveal that most people think that they themselves, their own bodies, are becoming resistant to the effects of antimicrobials. It's not even within the kind of biomedical vocabulary. Is it a very defined term? But then again, it's such a broad phenomenon. I mean, essentially what we are talking about is ecological change within our microbial environment to compensate for human drug usage, for human substance usage. And that is too broad, I think, for something that is actionable in the language of global health.
So Flavio, and then Daniel.
Yeah, I would have many questions, and there is one thing that I appreciated very much in your book, that is the framing of antimicrobial production in these Cold War terms, and the fact that they've been used in practice and also in discourses as a way to counter the rise of communism, for instance. And then I'm thinking how to frame antimicrobial production and antimicrobial resistance in our days, which means in the sort of international struggle that are taking place between, for instance, Western world or China and the US. In these terms, I saw that you pointing also to the fact that China now is the biggest producer and consumer of antibiotics for the fact that there are more and more CAFOs, so production of porks. And then my question is about what's your feeling about the agreements, if any, between, for instance, Chinese scientists and Western scientists about the problem of antimicrobial resistance. I saw that, for instance, in China a year ago, the use of antimicrobials as growth promoters has been banned, if I'm not wrong. So it seems that they are doing also a lot of work on this problem. At the same time, they also know that the use of antibiotics will be increasing in the next times.
Thanks. I mean, that's a great question, and I'll give you kind of two different answers to that. I think the first one is that with a large part of antimicrobial stewardship and the framing of it, it's about signaling a specific form of virtuous use. And the big power struggle at the international level is about whose use is the most virtuous, whose use is the right way to preserve the right form of microbial environment going forward. And what we've seen with the form of stewardship discourse that we have nowadays at the global level is a situation where China and other so-called BRICS or middle-income countries, or however you want to phrase it, are adopting specific forms of consumption which have been sold as a global way of progress, a global sign that you are a progressive society. You have made it. Your consumers are consuming the right kind of things. This is the kind of material way forward. And at the same time, they're being criticized for using the technologies that allowed high-income countries to achieve this form of consumption, to achieve this mode of production in the 1950s. So it's a paradoxical situation, very similar to climate change, actually, in terms of the discourse that's flying around. But where nowadays these countries are both, under pressure from their own consumers who have bought into this logic of consumption, and at the same time now under pressure from the global north to preserve the resources that enable this form of consumption and production. So China is very interesting in that regard. It's very interesting that you mentioned here the ban of growth promoters, which has been sold from from 1969 onwards as a result of UK pressure, and then from the 1990s onwards as a result of EU pressure, as the kind of par excellence technical intervention with which to rationally preserve your antimicrobial commons. That is, it was pioneered here as a way to get rid of the irrational use by farmers. So to hand over control of antimicrobial access to veterinary medical professionals, or to give regulators greater oversight over how specific forms of drugs are used. Ironically, however, these bans by themselves rarely, if ever, led to a decline of overall antimicrobial usage. So what is now being done in China is a replication of regulatory strategies that in the north were used to try to fix the antimicrobial infrastructure without actually reforming it. So in this very paradoxical situation, again, where you are blaming southern countries for using antimicrobials to achieve progress in exactly the same way that the North did this in the 50s and 60s, and B, where you are incentivizing structural fixes of technical fixes that have proven to be of limited effect in the global North, but are accepted by the international community as the way forward, because they were used in the global North, and the global North is now the kind of pressurizer for a specific form of stewardship going forward. With regards to the growth promoters, it's a fascinating story, because how do you define a growth promoter? Is it just the use of an antimicrobial below a certain dosage? Is it the use of an antimicrobial over a set amount of days? And how is growth promotion different from prophylactic antibiotic use, where you're medicating to prevent the predicted outbreak of a disease? How is prophylactic antibiotic use different from metaphylactic use, where some animals in, say, a herd have become sick, and you medicate the entire herd to prevent the disease from spreading forward in the herd? I mean, these are all, it's very slippery to actually find ways of precisely defining what is acceptable and what is unacceptable use. Every form of antimicrobial use will have repercussions on the microbial environment. And it's very telling that what is now being done in China is mirroring these attempts that we already had in the 1990s in the global North to protect the overall infrastructure by trying to rejig regulatory definitions, which at the end of the day don't make a huge impact.
Yeah, just to have a very short follow-up, and that's very interesting, because it seems that there is this reiteration of discourse to just circumvent a big problem, and it's a fix that doesn't work. What it seems that differs from the old discourse about what is been doing in China, it's about, and there is a work of Mindy Schneider, which is focused on this, that now these big CAFOs in China are sort of handled in a similar way for the handling of also the coronavirus in Wuhan and other areas in China, which means that often it seems that workers entering and exiting the facilities, and usually these workers, they sleep there, they live there in the facilities, they have to undertake 2 weeks of quarantine in both ways. So this is quite interesting to see how this chaotic microbial world is handled in a sort of military way.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I completely agree. And that's the interesting thing going forward. I mean, despite all of the ecological risk scenarios we espouse, the solutions that we try to impose on the microbial environment are very much, they rest in these very traditional quarantine modes of thinking and these very militarist ways of dealing with environments. I mean, it's not really a judgment. It's just how apparently those solutions seem to be the most palatable, both at the regulatory, economic, but also cultural way, because these workers, again, they are low paid, they have low social status. they can easily be integrated into scalable supply chains, and you end up with solutions that look exactly like you describe. This isn't just happening in China. Obviously, we've had similar precautionary measures to try to stop the introduction of foreign pathogens into European mass production facilities too. I mean, I think it's always important not just to focus then either on the global south or on the global north, but essentially we now live in a world where the technologies, the way these housing systems are designed, it's increasingly uniform, at least at this large scale of production.
Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, Claas, thank you so much. This is extremely interesting. I have also so many questions, but I'm going to stick to one, and that is when you mentioned earlier that the discourse is shifting, or you propose it shifting to the management of wider microbial environments. I was wondering if there is any role for soil microbial environments and the soil microbiome. I always find it striking that in all these discussions about One Health and AMR, there is some kind of the assumption that farming is animal production, meat production, and the entire field of producing through soil is missing. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about what resistant bacteria do in soil, and also how soil is perhaps seen as a reservoir for new antimicrobial agents, or in general its place in what you call antimicrobial commons, because soil, to my sense, is also one of the global hot topics that's coming up, and I'm wondering if you see points of contact here.
So that's an excellent question. So to give you a preview of this paper, it's called Waves of Attention, that we've currently got under review and will hopefully be coming out towards the end of the year. We did an analysis of 250 reports from the 1950s onwards to the present at the international level. And we only found 2 of them focusing on non-human, non-animal AMR components. So that gives you, and those are very recent. So that gives you a kind of insight into how limited One Health has actually been. I mean, One Health allows you to speak of southern environments in a deterritorialized way. That is often what's happened at the international level. It does link human and animal health, but it also allows northern funders to speak of risky territories in a way that does not necessarily have to account for sovereignty in the classic traditional way at the international level. And this is already foreshadowed again by the work of Nick King, with the scalar politics. How do you make sense of southern risks that require northern finance to northern funders? Well, you have to make the environment risky, and you have to interconnect these environments. You have to, in many ways, kind of strip away these post-1945 borders of sovereignty, and you have to make action meaningful to global funders. And you can show a similar way of this happening in the case of the global north after 2010. The soil as a kind of reservoir of risk. I mean, in many ways, again, with antimicrobial resistance, the interesting thing here is we're not speaking about pathogens necessarily. We're just speaking about a phenomenon by itself. Microbes don't care about antimicrobial resistance. They care about evolutionary advantages over other microbes in the soil that allow them to proliferate and allow them to continue to exist and manage their immediate environments too. So I think in the context of the soil, it is a phenomenon. Obviously, we have a microbiome that is becoming increasingly resistant. It's becoming a resistome around us, and that resistome is also prevalent in our soils that we have sprayed with antibiotics too. I mean, that's one thing that in the book I think gets too short shrift from me. It's more prominent in farming animals because I was doing more research at that time on Japanese agriculture, but a huge part of antimicrobial usage has also been on plants since the 1950s, where plants have been sprayed at scale against bacterial pathogens. This is both fruit crops, it's rice crops. A large part of the industrialization of Japanese rice production was achieved by combating rice blast disease. So Japan has the problem of actually not a lot of soil that is, suitable for production. It's quite a high country. So what you needed to do is, after 1945, there was this discourse of making the most of these resources, and antibiotics seemed an ideal way to combat pathogen landscapes in this environment. So they developed not just spraying techniques of existing antimicrobials, but they had a research program for new antimicrobials that were specifically designed as crop agents. And so these agents have a legacy in the soil. And at the same time, obviously, by using heavy metals and, by contaminating soil with other substances, the soil serves as a reservoir for co-selection of resistance too. And then you can add this with the waterways, where major cities have major sewage outlets where lots of humans have been swallowing drugs. And further down the line, you've got potentially some mass sties where the animals are also excreting these drugs into the system, where you also have co-selection in the environment. Again, by itself, this is just a phenomenon. It's just a phenomenon of continuous change in the microbial environment. I think it's naive to think of some kind of ideal state that you can stabilize of the global planetary microbiome. It continuously evolves, but over time it becomes a problem for all of our stewardship efforts if we only focus on human health and animal health and exclude the other one health domain, which functions as a reservoir in many ways.
Thanks. So I really appreciate your chapter on the British Soil Association. Are they the only ones who picked that up and made that connection explicit?
No, and there were also others. I mean, the Germans had, with the Nazi obsession on the soil and all of these things. There was also a strong focus on securing the purity of this alongside the purity of milk. In the post-war Bundesrepublik, with overhangs, again, strong overhangs from the Nazi era in that context. But then again, most of this new resistance knowledge that is from the 1960s onwards, and by that time, organic labels, actually, ironically, while the AMR risk scenarios are becoming ecological, organic labels start focusing very narrowly, actually, just on the animals.
Thanks.
I've got one more question if nobody else does. So I'm really interested in how fragile these infrastructures might be. You said sort of midway through our conversation today about how some of the regulatory language is just sort of subtly being transformed so as to protect these infrastructures. And I'm imagining a scenario at a certain point where it's not going to be an issue of rhetoric or politics or things in the domain of representation, but it's going to be an ontological problem, or maybe ontology bleeding into political economy. So how close are we to the breakdown of these infrastructures as these different kinds of resistances accumulate and circulate?
So I think that prediction is nearly impossible to make, because there is antibiotic innovation going on, right? There is no reason why in the next 10 years we don't suddenly have 2 effective new antibiotic classes against gram negatives, and then suddenly, the kind of timescales change. I think that the infrastructure is eternally crumbling, and I think crumbling is actually a better metaphor of speaking about it. It's like a bridge that you continuously need to fix. And at the moment, lots of the bridges that we rely on are getting quite crumbly. In many cases, specifically the bridges that we rely on to treat gram-negative infections, and specifically those ones that we rely on to compensate for the absence of healthcare or animal healthcare in the global south. And those are becoming quite precarious, but also in lots of the high-tech settings of Western medicine, where, for example, if you encounter multiple drug-resistant organisms in US hospitals for some conditions nowadays, it is a serious problem for you, both in terms of morbidity and mortality going forward. And I think the very interesting point historically in all of this is a shift that occurred in the mid-2000s. I mean, we always focus on the 1990s as this kind of big bioterrorism shift, but what really happened in the 2000s, also again from the UK, which is interesting, is this attempt to start quantifying risk. And this quantification by the O'Neill report, which was released in 2016, is one of the first times that they not just try to do this for hospital infections, but they try to phrase it as a wider infrastructural risk to humanity. And that then leads them to come up with these crazy cost estimates that are then supposed to, and actually quite successfully do mobilize action at the UN level and the commitment of donor funds. How helpful it is to phrase something as an apocalypse, I have my questions, because many antibiotics still work, right? And they will continue to work against specific things. It's not as though suddenly somebody turns off the lights. And I think that's a big problem with communicating antimicrobial resistance, is some things will continue to work, but many people will suffer conditions that are much more difficult to treat, will require different drugs that are much more toxic. Some people will die, often poor people in poorer countries suffering from old diseases that are now coming back in a multiple drug resistant form. But it's the problem with communication is that AMR, just as it means different resistance factors in different ecologies, means different things for people in different societies around the planet. So it is a global health risk, but the shape of this risk is much more complex than COVID-19, much more complex than climate change, where at least they have a degree, right? That the big communication success is that they have 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees that everybody is aiming for. Whereas with AMR, I mean, what are you aiming for? You know, there is no optimum stabilization. It's just management.
Flavio, one final word, and then we'll have to go because we're at the witching hour.
Yeah, just super quick. So Claas is not a matter of framing antimicrobial resistance as the defiance of modernity, as some other authors have highlighted. I appreciate your comment very much.
Great. Well, thank you, Claas. This has been a lovely discussion of some quite horrific things, but really enlightening. And I hope to see you back in the reading group sometime soon. Next week, Rachel, do you want to do the honors, or I could do the honors for Edna?
Go ahead. I don't.
Great. So next week, I think it's an hour later, we're going to have a discussion with Edna Bonham, a recent PhD from Princeton University. She's a reformed biologist who is now a scholar and writer, a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, where she's collaborating with a lot of artists and writers. So next week we'll be engaging with her work and continuing the conversation. So thanks again, Claas. I hope to revisit Wolfson College someday. And
thanks for having me. I hope I wasn't too pessimistic. There is hope, but it is complex.
Yeah, I think that bridge metaphor is a great note to end on. I think everyone wants to look towards the apocalypse, but infrastructures get repaired and sometimes with piecemeal contingent patches. But we also, I think you referenced Hannah Landecker, maybe thinking with her partner Chris Kelty, have to think about evil in infrastructures sometimes too, and others, the sorts of ethics and values that are embedded in infrastructural assemblages. So thanks a lot for helping us think through this case, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Claas.
Bye.
Thanks for
Bye,
great
everyone.
questions. Bye.